Hey, Alec here, founder of Rosen Rogues, and today we're doing something a little different. I'm going to be taking a simulation in EmberGen that one of you guys made and tweaking it and improving it. I was on JengaFX Discord recently, and somebody had posted a simulation that they were having trouble getting to look the way they wanted, and I decided to help them out by jumping into their project file and kind of seeing what they were doing and where things could be optimized. And I got done with it and figured a lot of people could probably benefit from seeing how I troubleshoot these sorts of issues. You know, when you sort of have something set up, but it's not looking the way you really want. It's not looking as smooth or as clean as you would like it to. I'm going to show you how I took this simulation from this to this. Okay, so here we are in EmberGen, and this is sort of the original look. I don't have the model that he had, so I've replaced it with one of my own. But if I play this right now, it's going to stutter a lot. And that's because, first things first, he's kind of trying to brute force the quality here. They're doing this by upscaling it by 3. If the base sim isn't really looking great, simply upscaling it isn't actually going to usually fix your problems. And the upscaling is just really sort of a last resort to really add some micro detail in a sim that's already looking good. I'm going to turn this to none so that way we actually get a decent playback. So we have these jaggly lines here. There's all sorts of forces affecting this, supposedly. We got some nice, vorticles going through, but none of them are affecting the sim at all. And so we need to start looking through this to figure out where our errors are. Generally, the best place to start is at the heart of your simulation, and that's the simulation node. So I'm going to go into the simulation node, and I'm going to take a look around here. Now, we already fixed the upscaling issue, and as I keep scrolling down, the next issue I'm going to find is right here, which is under time control. Now, this is one of the most complicated parts of EmberGen, but I'm going to try to explain this in a way that makes sense. Your time step essentially is how many opportunities per second EmberGen has to calculate where the particles and voxels should be. So having this at a really low number, let's say I turn this down to like 3, means it has no time to figure out where anything should be. And it's just going to make this really horrible thing. So 24 seems to make sense if your frame rate is 24 frames a second, right? So you'd say it's 24 frames a second. I want every frame to have one calculation. The problem with that is it's not actually enough calculations to get a smooth look. It means things are going to jump from one spot to another, which is why you're seeing this gap here in the ears. So if we wanted to smooth that out, we could add more calculations, in this case 48, and now we're doubled it, and now you can see we're getting rid of these kind of jaggities between the ears. And if I make this instead of 48, 48 plus 24 is what, 72, I believe, and now we're getting a pretty smooth experience. And you can see this really clearly if I go back down to 24 and hit play. And there it is again. So that's one of our major problems. If it's at 24 frames a second, if I'm rendering at 24 frames a second, and I'm adding in essentially frames, but I'm adding in a time step of 48, won't it play back twice as fast? And that's actually true. You will get this 2 times playback speed sort of issue. And how you fix this is if you go to 48 here, and we're going to pretend, I believe my render is actually at 30, but you can override this and say 24. So if my original frame rate is 24, and then I'm making this 48, how I fix this on the end is when I go to one of my export tabs, any of these exports, I change my frame stride to 2. And now I'm only going to be exporting every other frame while still doing calculations on the between frames, right? So now we're getting all the smoothness we want without changing our frame rate, essentially, and making it play too fast or too slow. There's a cheat sheet for this that James Key has made over at JengaFX, which I'll try to figure out a way to upload for you guys to look at. But more or less, you can just kind of see, if I'm going to be rendering this at 24 frames a second, and I want it to have a time step of 72, I'm only going to render every 3rd frame. Same thing with 2, 24, right? So whatever you're timesing your frame rate by, whatever you're multiplying this by, you're going to make that your frame stride. And then what that's going to do is allow you to have a higher time step. So I hope that makes sense. More or less, this is how smooth it is, how many calculations per second. If you're going to give it 48 times to refresh, you know, it gets to refresh 48 times. It's cool, but then I need to render half the frames. So 48 may not be bad for this, but that's actually not the biggest issue here. It is an issue, but the bigger issue seems to be that everything just sort of flies right off the screen, and there's no time for these vorticals or these forces to affect anything. So let's see if we can't fix that, as well as get some more micro details into the simulation to avoid these other sort of jaggedies that we have going on. So what's next? Well, let's keep going through our simulation tab. This looks fine. Nothing's really changed from the default. Combustion's fine. Dissipation seems reasonable. These all seem pretty much default. We've changed the smoke range slightly for vorticity. This doesn't seem to be affecting anything too much. So you can kind of leave it close to where he had it. Force seems fine. The buoyancy's been turned off, so it's not, you know, floating up or down. Our smoke weight is really heavy, which is interesting because it's not falling down at all. So we're missing something here, and there we have it, the wind. As you can see, our wind direction in Y, which is, if you can look at our little gizmo down here, this way, is turned up to max, to 1. Now, 1 doesn't seem like a high number, but really when you're talking about 1 or 0, this is essentially max or nothing. So if we drop that down to nothing, we can see now all these different effects are sort of taking place. Now this smoke weight, which is 235% of the gravity, is actually affecting it. So our wind speed was simply way too high. So we're going to keep playing with this wind speed, you know, keep lowering it to be something more reasonable. And if I make this sort of like over here, you know, down to like 0.5, we'll just do a clean 0.5. And we'll do a clean 0.01. Now we're noticing everything else is cranked way too high. And this is something that's easy to happen when you're making a simulation, is one thing sort of gets offset a little too high, and then you have to crank everything else to try to match. And when you crank everything else, it starts doing unexpected things. So low numbers, sticking kind of low on the, you know, delicate end of things usually helps. So let's go back to our force. And remember, we saw that smoke weight was 235% of the gravity, and that's really high. So if I hit reset that to 0, now it's sort of just going straight back, which might be more of what we want. The other thing we can look at is all of our effects. These are also all probably cranked too high. So let's turn them all off and then sort of go one by one until we can get the look we want. Now we have sort of this base level sim, but there's not a lot of detail to it. I want to make this way more detailed. So what we're going to do to make this more detailed is, first and foremost, in our original shape, let's break this up. So what I'm going to do is add a shape noise and add a shape blend. And then instead of piping these directly into our main shape, we're going to pump this into our shape A and our shape B. And what this is going to do is sort of break up our spawning layer. And as you can see, if I turn this off, we go from having this like very clean spawning here to having a broken up spawn. And we can kind of change the settings here to get what we want, right? Change this higher, change that lower. Look at our amplitude. We can mess with how these interact and the smoothness of it. If I turn the smoothness up to 10, you can see it's sort of like, you know, doing this very, very interpolated thing. You can't even make out the face really, that's too high. If you turn it down to 0, it might not be smooth enough at all. We're sort of getting these jaggies back. So somewhere in between, I find is generally good. The default's like 1.5, you know, so maybe we'll do like 2, you know. Okay, so now we're getting sort of a more interesting spawn. You know, I'm going to make that even smaller, just to create some micro details here, rather than major big ones. But yeah, that's a pretty interesting shape. All right, what else can we do? The next thing I'm going to do is actually go to our volume post-processing. As you can see here, we have it on dilate. And what this is doing is sort of expanding or shrinking our smoke. And dilate's fine if you're making explosions and stuff. It can be good for different types of smoke. But here, I'm actually going to change this to none first, see how that looks. Okay, we're sort of getting a little bit too stark, right? So let's change it to motion blur. And what this is going to also do is sort of help with smoothing out that jaggedy edge. So the higher I turn my motion blur, you'll notice it's sort of smoothing out the simulation a lot. And so we went from this like very jagged, you know, easily to see the outlines of this guy to sort of a smoother effect here where it's harder to make out where he starts and the smoke ends. Now we're getting a couple of cool effects here, but not enough. That's where our forces are going to come back in. So we have our vorticals, and that's what's creating those cool little wispies now and then. I like that. Frankly, I think we can even spawn a few more. And that might give us some more interesting, yeah, those little wisps. So that's looking a little bit better. So now that we've had a look at our vorticals, let's take a look at our noise. So these sort of work a little differently, having the forces going into your emitter volume versus having them go into the simulation. And one example for this is, let's say I had some particles here. If I turn this on, you can see they're not really getting affected by these forces, right? I can turn these forces off and the particles more or less look the same. Versus if I turn these ones on, now the particles are going to be getting affected. So just keep a note for some of that. You might have some forces running around that don't seem to be affecting anything. And that's because you might have them plugged into your emitter volume as opposed to your simulation. So I'm gonna get rid of those particles because we don't need them for now. And I'm actually I might get rid of these ones too, because I'd rather control them after they get spawned, I believe. This could help if you need this broken up more. I could play with turning the gain up here and you can kind of see what's happening. This is another way to break it up. It's not a bad idea, but it can cause some issues if you're trying to affect your particles and they're not getting affected and you're messing around with these, you know, this force noise. You're like, why aren't my particles changing? It's because this is going into your emitter and not your simulation. So it's just happening at a different point in the sim. So I'm gonna turn those off there, and let's turn on the same two forces we have, but for our simulation. And here we go. And that's interesting, but it looks like they're way too high, probably because of when we had the wind and the gravity too high earlier. So you can probably turn this down a little bit and not make it so crazy. First off, the scale is a bit much. Let's shrink that scale down. Then let's look at our amplitude here. And let's drop that down. So your amplitude, right, you can kind of see is controlling how much this is affecting the sim. So there you have a bit of a different look than we had before. It's a lot smoother. And you'll notice we're still keeping a lot of the details, right? You can still see his ears, his nose, his mouth, but it's not as crazy as far as those stair stepping goes and the other effects. And we're getting this nice smooth fall off as opposed to that super, super jaggedy fall off. The last setting he has here is this force line. My guess is, again, the gravity was really high, and so he was trying to correct it with this. This essentially is going to push it down or push it up. So he was kind of using this to aid in the gravity, but I actually don't think we even need this at all. I prefer the sims to play a little bit slower, unless this thing's like flying 100 miles per hour. You know, this isn't going to feel like super heavy smoke this way. So what we can do is come back to our simulation and just check out our force and our buoyancy and our gravity again. So let's turn up the weight a little bit just to try to add a bit more detail to this. And the last thing I'm going to do is look at our vorticity. Right now we have a very tiny bit of vorticity, and our large vorticity is a bit. So turning this up will make it more chaotic, right? You can kind of see. We don't need it that high, obviously, just a little bit. And then large vorticity, generally you don't want to touch, but for some sims, it just adds that extra bit of oomph. And I kind of really like it for stuff like this. So you can see here, we can kind of dial in a sweet spot. But if I turn it all the way off, if I turn both these all the way off, it's going to get more kind of smooth. And this is going to increase kind of the turbulence, right? How wispy and complex it is. Think of this as like cigarette smoke on zero / candle smoke. And if you turn it way up, you're looking at more like explosion and fire, like a house on fire smoke, very chaotic and kind of noisy. And I kind of consider dust, dust storms and smoke sims to be like more like this. And then it's just a matter of tweaking. But you can notice that I'm staying pretty subtle with things like wind speed, even with my vorticity, and including my dissipation is kind of high here because you want it falling out. Your gravity here, you can play with this stuff, but making things 300% to try to compensate for something else being too high easily causes problems. I really enjoyed doing this. I really enjoyed kind of breaking this apart and looking at what sort of went wrong and how to improve it, how to optimize it and make it run better. I enjoyed this project so much that I've decided I'm going to open this up as a service that I offer. If you want me to take a look at your LiquidGen or EmberGen project, let me know and I'm happy to take a look for a small fee. I really enjoyed doing this, but I realized it actually took most of my weekend. So if you want to hop on a private one-on-one call, just a quick consultation where I can kind of look through and point out where things should be, that'll be a set amount. And then there'll be a second amount for if you want me to actually like go in, open up your project on my computer and really get into the guts of it and figure out what exactly is going wrong or right. I've also hopped on calls with viewers before just to talk before they get into a project, just to sort of plan it out and think about what might be the best way to set it up, how they might want to set up their 3D models or their FBX or Alembic files so they import right and have the correct interactions that they're hoping to get out of their simulation. If that sounds interesting to you, hit me up at alec@royalsandrogues.com, leave a comment below, or hop on our Discord, which will be linked below this video. I might do more of these sort of quick tutorials for EmberGen, LiquidGen, C4D, Blender, and maybe even Unreal Engine as I get into that, as well as some other apps like Move AI, and just fun little, how to optimize your workflow. I'm trying to figure out the balance of this channel, as you can probably tell, between concepts and lectures and practical tutorials, as well as sort of updates on our own projects. So if any of that rambling sounds interesting to you, hit subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.